In 300 AD, the Roman Emperor Constantine did two things that were notable and had some fairly long-term impacts. The first thing was he legalized the Christian religion and gave it legal status and ended the persecution for that faith. The second thing he did is he moved the capital of the Roman Empire from Rome in the west to Constantinople in the east. That's over in Turkey, what is now Turkey, and that city is now Istanbul. So we now have a nominally Christian empire because two emperors after Constantine had legalized the Christian religion, and an emperor, two emperors removed from him, made it the state religion. So now you have the state and religion married to each other. That doesn't normally end well. And that did send a whole cascading effect down through history that's affected all of us. But that's not my story. And this isn't going to be a long-winded history lesson. I'm telling this story to make a point. In 404 AD, there was a monk, Christian monk, named Telemachus. He was from the eastern leg of the empire. And he decided for some reason to go to Rome, whether on a pilgrimage or what. So in 404 AD, Telemachus went to Rome, and what he saw there appalled him. The Roman Empire, still the western leg of it, still centered in Rome, was utterly corrupt and depraved, and really challenged his conscience. In addition, they were still practicing gladiator games. So they're nominally Christian, but they're still sending people into the arena to fight each other to the death for the entertainment of the crowds. This had been a routine or a sport, if you will, if you want to call it that, since about 200 BC. So this was a long-standing activity, about 600 years. Anyway, Telemachus was so appalled by what he saw in Rome and by these gladiator games where people were still forced to kill each other for the entertainment of the crowds. And there's a point, I think, where a culture or a government or an ideology is so rancidly evil that people with a sensitive conscience, particularly Christians, are so appalled that their conscience compels them to act. That happened to Telemachus. One day during the gladiator games, he stepped into the arena in front of all the crowds. There were two gladiators fighting to the death. Telemachus intervened. He got between them and put a stop to it. The gladiators did not turn on him and kill him, but the crowds did. They stoned him to death. And the emperor at that time, who would have been at least nominally Christian, was so moved by Telemachus's moral courage and taking a moral stand into the public square that cost him his life. He was so taken by that he put an end to the gladiator games forevermore. And that was the last recorded gladiator contests in history. I bring this up because Christians have always lived out their faith, loving God and loving people by stepping into the public square or into the arena or into the social battle lines, political battle lines, and trying to make a difference. Okay. Pretty much until now. In roughly 2020, government shut down our churches due to COVID, if you'll recall. Nearly all the churches complied and closed their doors. There's a few exceptions, but not very many. And the question that pops into my mind is, how come Walmart didn't close? How come the casinos didn't close? How come some of the larger nationally known chain stores didn't close, yet the churches closed? I think it was a beta test by some evil people managed things behind the scenes that were testing to see how far they could push our culture and our civilization before we got pushed back. There was two other effects to that. First of all, in my judgment, that exposed the dead pulpits of America. And it also caused a lot of Christians from the rank and file to stand up and wake up and say, if we're going to fix this civilization, our church leaders aren't going to lead us onto the battlefield. We're going to have to stand and fight on our own. That's what I want to talk about a little bit. The issue with the American church primarily is they don't want to offend anyone. If you offend somebody, they're going to get mad. They may leave. And this is a real convoluted doctrine that I can't quite get my head around. But we need to talk about Jesus. And if we offend somebody, they're not going to want to hear about Jesus. And so they won't be saved. I happen to think that particularly twist of theology is nonsense, and there's some reasons for it. A couple of years ago, I had breakfast with a fairly prominent local church leader because I wanted to know why the church wasn't standing up and speaking out. You know, we've had abortion since 1973. Killed, as far as we can tell, maybe 60 or 70 million babies in the womb. We've got homosexuals demanding their rights and coming into our churches. And you can check your Bible on that one and see how God views it. Now we've got transgenders, people coming into our schools and trying to convince our children without their parental knowledge to mutilate themselves at exactly the ages where they're vulnerable and haven't really sorted out who they are into adulthood yet. This is not a good thing. So I had breakfast with this church leader, and we talked about the border crossing and how that was these illegals were coming in, and many of them were being trafficked, particularly children. And this next little example is going to really offend people, but I'm going to talk about it anyway. Picture yourself if you're a 6-year-old child living somewhere in Mexico. You're not rich, but you have a stable home, stable family, mom and a dad who love you, maybe a brother and sister. You have a warm and secure bed at night, and you sleep peacefully. And this is your life and your environment, and you have your friends in your school. One day on the way home from school, pickup truck stops next to you and grabs you. The next morning, you find yourself, don't know where, have no idea, and you're put into the back of a semi-trailer with about 30 other children, screaming, horrified, hurting, wetting themselves. Doors are closed. You are trafficked across the American border at a portal that is controlled by the people running this. They either bought or threatened or intimidated the guards, so there's nothing to stop your flow in. A couple days later, and you're 6 years old, after you've been raped multiple times and screamed until your vocal cords gave out, and many of the children, boys and girls, have experienced that same trauma. Now you're taken somewhere in a warehouse in a remote area. And this is actually happening. I want you to pay attention. Don't shut me down yet. You may well be housed in a cage, out of sight, out of the reach of any protection. And when you're not being raped, from time to time, you're being taken out of that cage, tortured and terrorized to force your adrenaline in your system to spike into your bloodstream so that they can tap your blood. That's called adrenochrome. It's a huge international industry, and a lot of our freak Hollywood people, rich people, politicians, they get off on this. I'm not making any of this up. If you're lucky, you won't have to survive that for long, because eventually they may well kill you and take your organs and market them. If you think I'm making this up, you are dead wrong. There's at least 85,000 missing children that came across the border under the Biden administration. Missing. They went right into those sex trafficking rings. And Biden will not seal the border, nor will our politicians. They just approved another $65 billion to Ukraine in a lost war that had nothing to do with winning the war. It's all filtered back into the pockets of people getting rich. Not $1 of that is earmarked to close the border or protect our children or whatever. The reason I tell this story is I brought this up to this church leader. I didn't get into quite that graphic of a detail, but he knew what was going on. He was aware of it. And I said, why isn't the church standing up to some of these things? Why do we never talk about abortion? We got all these, it's not just the babies, the fatalities, but we've got all these walking wounded who have to live with that decisions, and we don't want to talk about it as a church. So my friend, the church leader, had a real simple answer. He said, if we deal with this here, Satan's just going to pop up somewhere else. And that's the way it's going to be until Jesus returns. In other words, and I've got a word for this, it's whack-a-mole. And whack-a-mole is that game where you have a mallet and these things keep popping up and you knock one down and it pops up somewhere else and you knock it down. And I think that was his attitude, that we're not going to fix this anyway. So let's just move on and talk about Jesus. There's a takeoff on that, which is that God's got a plan. He's in complete control. Our job is to talk about Jesus and pray, and then just sit back and watch and see what Jesus does, because he's got this all under control. That's not what Christians do. I don't know where this theology comes from, frankly, but I don't know how you can fail to defend small children, to at least speak out on these issues, because it doesn't matter until Christ returns. What in the world kind of a theology is that? But that's what we're hearing from some of our churches. And a lot of our churches, nearly all of them, don't want to offend anybody. So they're not going to take a moral stand on anything. Okay, won't do it. And I run into this all the time. The good news is, since COVID and the church is shut down, a lot of Christians have decided their leadership isn't going to save them. Their leadership isn't going to lead them into the front lines of the cultural and moral battle. So they're going to take matters into their own hands. And we are. I'm on the internet a lot, running into podcasts challenging the politics and the evil in the world with facts and evidence. And many of the people doing these podcasts are Christians and end with a prayer in the name of Jesus. So the lay people are beginning to stand up, and there's a few church leaders that do, but not very many. And I wanted to bring this up as a challenge. I'm not suggesting people walk out on their churches. We need that church culture. We need a place to go and express our faith, to reinforce our faith with other Christians, to bring our children, to have them raised within the faith in a safe and reinforcing environment, and to bring new Christians in to start getting connected. Beyond that, honestly, I don't know much. I don't know how much good our church leadership is anymore. And I'm sorry to say this. I used to be real timid about speaking out, but you know what? The stakes are way too high. And these children are facing unimaginable suffering. They will, even if they were rescued, I don't know how you recover from that kind of trauma. And we won't talk about it. We just want to talk about Jesus and trust him to fix all this. That's not the way Christianity has ever worked. And I don't know where that kind of theology comes from, but a lot of it's just flat out cowardice, frankly. You know, we want to protect our institutions, our job. We don't want people walking out or calling us names or whatever. Problem is, we're beyond that. Our civilization is collapsing. It's time for people to challenge themselves and say, what am I following here? And not necessarily to walk out on your church, and even to try and still respect your leadership within the context of that church, because they have certain responsibilities and so forth. And I'd like to think that there'd be somebody when I die that would say nice things over my body to comfort my survivors. So they do have some use yet. Okay. Jesus covered this in Matthew 23 regarding the church leadership of his day. He said they have a legitimate place. They sit in Moses' seat. So you need to respect that, and at least within the confines of the church, you need to do what they say and show them that respect. But then he went on. He said, but don't be like them. And then he went on to describe the condition of the religious leadership of his day, and it's not pretty. I'm challenging anybody who might trip over this video not to leave your church, not to disrespect your church leaders, but to take a hard look in the mirror and say, what does it look like to live out my faith? Am I going to buy into this nonsense that we don't want to ever offend anybody? Am I going to buy into this nonsense that if we just introduce somebody to Jesus, he's going to take care of everything because he's got a plan? The problem is God works through human agency. He does have a plan. He does have control, but he works through people. And people, Christian people, have always made a difference throughout history, but not now, not in America. We have wounded people in every church in America. Those wounds aren't getting healed because the church won't challenge people to bring their issues out onto the table, seek forgiveness, and get them dealt with. They're not going to do it for the most part. So my challenge here is to please wake up and take a look around, decide if you're going to make a stand. In war, weak leadership is likely to get you killed. You can't, when the battle's raging, you can't really sit back in the bunker and hide and hope you don't get overrun. If you're going to win, you're going to have to come out and fight at some point. And, most of these church leaders, I don't look for any spiritual guidance from them. I wouldn't trust most of them to lead me out of a Walmart parking lot. Most of them are nice people. I'm sure some of them love God, but they're bankrupt of any moral fiber that will cause them to stand up, step into the public square or the arena, and challenge our culture with truth. We have people from this whole abortion issue that are wounded. In every abortion, you've got one fatality, the child, and at least two walking wounded. And the walking wounded, the mom and dad have to live with that decision forevermore. And they are able to soften their conscience on it because our culture, the world system, has built a narrative for them to validate that decision. It says, my body, my choice. You can't tell me what to do. It's my body. This is just a clump of tissue. Okay. All of that's a lie. But if the culture, the world, presents that lie and digs into it hard enough, I, with that open wound, can find some measure of anesthetizing my conscience and validating that decision. The problem is that wound is still in there. It's going to express itself in other ways. It might come out as anger, might come out as depression. A lot of times, we look at people that have these issues. They have an anger issue. They're cycling through depression. They're highly judgmental and real sensitive about it. All of this stuff, those are symptoms. There's something going on inside that hasn't been dealt with. And I have to believe, after all these years and all these decisions to terminate the life of your baby, we have a lot of walking wounded running around that are not getting healed because we're letting that world narrative overrun us culturally, and there's no counter narrative to challenge it because the church won't talk about it. Okay. I'm a little upset with church leadership, and I'm tired of trying to sit quietly, which I don't generally do anyway. And that's not the only issue. There's so many issues out there, and so many walking wounded that aren't being dealt with. So many innocent people that are not being protected because the church will not take a moral stand and say, this is right and this is wrong. Having said all that, I want to close with a story and a picture and a challenge to all of us to wake up, to stand up, to decide where are the front lines in this battle, morally, culturally, and so forth, and then have just enough courage to take the first step onto the battlefield and trust that God's going to show up. Chances are he's already out there. Tbilisi, Georgia. Georgia is an Eastern European nation. They were a satellite of the Soviet Union. So they were controlled and communist for a couple of generations. When the Soviet Union fell and collapsed, they got their independence back. The Eastern Orthodox Christian Church had been driven underground during the communist rule. They were still there, but they didn't have free rein to really come into public view. So Georgia regained its independence. The church came out of the shadows and again was able to engage the culture and begin making a difference. This goes back to maybe 2021. I don't have the exact date, but in Georgia, Tbilisi, which I believe is the capital, the gays and the lesbians decided they were going to go into the streets and do what they do. You know, they had an issue and they were going to stage protests, go into the streets and demand their rights. And so they did. And they were in the streets of Tbilisi, Georgia, and acting out, protesting, making their demands. This is what happened. This is a picture of Tbilisi, Georgia, on the day that those riots occurred. And what I'd like you to do is understand all those people standing elbow to elbow were not supporting the gay rights. They were standing against it. Please look at the front line of this picture. The front line in their clerical robes, locking arms and forming a wall between the protesters and their flock were the Orthodox priests. That's what leaders do. They take up the front lines. They stand between their flock and danger. And we are not doing it. There are Christian leaders that stand up, but they are so few and far between. And when you can know what's happening with these children being trafficked across the border, shrug your shoulders and say, it's not really our thing. Satan's just going to pop up somewhere else anyway. Let's just talk about Jesus. Ask yourself, is there something wrong with that picture, with that theology? And if so, what are you going to do about it? Leaders protect and lead their people. And they stand between their flock and danger. So I'm challenging all of us to consider not leaving our church. You know, we need that culture, we need that church experience and so forth. But you need to look at the limitations of your leadership and make a decision, all of us, for ourselves. How are we going to live out our faith? Okay, thanks for watching.